Jack Henderson was born in suburban Detroit into a family where prejudice and racism were not just the norm, but part of everyday life. His father, Walter, worked in a factory where the talk was about right people and proper places for blacks. His mother, Mary, supported her husband in his beliefs, and from childhood Jack learned that black people were the ones you couldn't deal with. Because they weren't like that, Jack was taught that their own were those who shared their cultural and social norms. This became the foundation of his worldview. When Jack was a child, he often heard his father say things like, "Don't talk when black people are around, they might hurt you," or "once they start making money, they'll be like us." These attitudes permeated the mind, creating a world where we were white and they were always those who didn't fit the standard. In his childhood eyes, dark-skinned people seemed something alien, dangerous, and unfriendly. At school, Jack felt this separation, even though he had many friends among the other students. However, it was quite obvious to him that black children were always in a different, inferior position. They were beaten, they were made fun of, they were not friends. And Jack often watched these scenes in silence, for his parents had taught him that black people were second class. In his mind, their lives were too far removed from his own for him to socialize with them. For anyone who was different seemed inappropriate. His view of black people caused a number of confrontations and fights at school. Jack witnessed his classmates devolve into stereotyping and ridicule. At one point, looking at the resentful and withdrawn black students, he thought they deserved to be seen that way because they were different. He often convinced himself that this behavior was a result of their poverty, their backgrounds, and the way they were raised. This sense of alienation never left him. One vivid episode occurred when Jack and his friends, while walking in the park, saw a group of black teenagers talking loudly and laughing. Jack thought their fun was too loud and unacceptable. He told his friends, "Don't get too close, they might attack." It wasn't so much fear as a deep-seated belief that such people just couldn't be normal. He didn't realize how much his words hurt others, nor did he even try to understand that their behavior was no different from his own habits. When Jack went to college, he could not avoid contact with people of different races and cultures. However, even in this world that was new to him, despite the abundance of opportunities, he continued to look for his and other people's traits in people. Students of other ethnicities were something alien and unpleasant to him. He preferred to socialize with his white peers, even though he himself had to recognize that the world was much more diverse than he could imagine. His bias became even more evident when he had to work in a group with a black student named John. Jack tried not to interact with him, but the project they were working on required them to work together. When Jack saw that John had successfully proposed several ideas that were superior to his own, he felt his convictions begin to waver. He tried not to notice it, but there was a sense of shame inside. Jack didn't know how to deal with it because he had been brought up to despise the likes of John. The question in his head was, how come he was smarter than me? After working at the corporation for several years, Jack continued to follow his beliefs. He avoided socializing with black colleagues, trying to please those who shared his views. One of his greatest moments was discussing with his coworkers about new appointments in the company. When it came to executive candidates, Jack conversationally said, "Well, they're certainly not going to pick someone from the black community. It's not their place." This statement elicited laughter and support from others, which confirmed his confidence that he was right. Jack felt his surroundings supported his views, and this reinforced his feeling that everything was right. However, this path came to its breaking point when Jack changed careers and became a cab driver. He assumed that cab driving would be his safe haven, where he didn't need to seek out anyone as a friend, just work. But he soon realized that this job would bring him something more, encountering different people. This was a challenge to his preconceptions because he encountered people from different cultures on a daily basis, and his stereotypes were often proven wrong. Each passenger in his car that he interacted with embodied a whole story that he was willing to interpret in his own way. When he was brought to poor neighborhoods where Black people lived, Jack still found their behavior and lifestyle to be misguided. He often wondered what could have caused them to live in such conditions, but his mind always returned to his old beliefs. They can't be normal people if they don't strive to be better. But then one day Jack met Marcus, a Black man in a strict suit, who immediately knocked him out of his usual stereotype. At first, Jack thought it was odd that such a man would choose a cab. He had expected to see a marginalized man, a loser, not a man who looked the way Jack would have imagined a successful white man to look. In his conversation with Marcus, Jack still tried to find some trace of the very stereotypes he knew. However, Marcus turned out to be intelligent, sincere, and determined. When the latter told Jack that he was working on becoming a doctor, it threw him off balance. He thought, how did this guy, who was essentially one of those people who was different and unattractive to me not too long ago, now turn out to be smarter and more successful than me? That conversation got him thinking, but the old views were deeply ingrained and Jack couldn't get rid of them right away. That date was a turning point in his life, and even though he tried to confront his beliefs, Jack couldn't get rid of his thoughts about Marcus, about how he, being dark-skinned, could be successful, and most importantly, someone who didn't fit his stereotypes. After his conversation with Marcus, Jack couldn't get rid of the thoughts that kept him going. He would return home, feeling something shift in his mind. He tried again and again to regain the familiar certainty that Black people couldn't be the same as white people, that their way would always be different, that their lives were limited to certain boundaries. But thoughts of Marcus, of his confidence and professionalism, would not let him go. He began to repeat to himself often that that man could not be an example for all Blacks, for he was just the exception. Each time, however, his logic became more shaky. A few weeks later, Jack met Louise, another passenger who, unlike Marcus, presented a very different image. Louise was young, poor, and unemployed. His clothes were dirty and his manner careless. Jack felt his old stereotypes starting to reappear. This is it, the confirmation of all my thoughts. This is the kind of guy you never want to hang out with. It's people like him who can't accomplish anything. But to Jack's surprise, Louise turned out to be surprisingly intelligent. He told him that he had once studied to be an engineer, but because of the recession and the loss of his job, he found himself in a difficult situation. He didn't complain, but he was also frank about how hard it was for him. Louise talked about his dreams, how he wants to go back to university again and continue his studies. This conversation stumped Jack again. He couldn't accept the idea that Louise, this man with this visible level of poverty and failure, could be something more if he had the opportunity. Jack couldn't give up his old views, but amidst these encounters, his notion that people were confined to their social roles because of race or background began to crack at the seams. The following week, Jack met Marcus again, who was wearing the same suit but now looked even more confident. They got to talking and Marcus invited him to meet some friends. Jack was initially hesitant, but for some reason agreed. He thought that maybe this meeting would help him to better understand what these people were and to reaffirm his beliefs. At the meeting, Jack found himself among people who didn't fit his stereotypes at all. There were many successful Black people, but among them were also those who were going through difficulties. Some of them talked about their struggles with the system, with the racial prejudices they had encountered on their way to success. Jack felt uncomfortable, even a little ashamed. He was surrounded by people who were not only intelligent, but deeply aware of society's problems, and their words made him think about a lot of things. He could feel his old beliefs starting to crumble, but there was something in him that wouldn't let him let go of those thoughts right away. The phrases he had heard since he was a child, "blacks will always be black, and they will never be like us," still echoed in his head. As he interacted with these people, Jack felt his worldview begin to change. Issues that once seemed obvious to him were now becoming complex. When Kendra, one of the women at the meeting, talked about how she had become a successful lawyer despite all the stereotypes, Jack thought, how wrong I was. He began to realize that many of these people were not who he thought they were. In his thoughts, he began to move from the category of they to the more personal stories they shared. A question arose in his mind that he tried to push away from him. What if I'm wrong? What if it's not racial differences, but just different life circumstances?